Hi, welcome back. I'm Heather, and this is Recently Seen Reading. I've had a good reading week, all things considered. I have a little bit of a book hangover from one thing I finished, but all in all, it's been a good week. I made progress on some nonfiction November reading, some Digithon reading, and some general reading. So the first one I finished for nonfiction November is Saidiya Hartman's Wayward Lives, Beautiful Experiments. This came out in 2019, so last year, and it's the history of Black women living in Philadelphia and New York between 1900 and 1920. And it's a fabulous book. It's not a traditional history. Hartman is very committed to re-examining archives and, where necessary, imagining or reimagining the lives of the women whose lives appear in fragments in archives. So one of the things that's quite compelling in this book is the way that Hartman reinterprets the significance of women whose lives would have been described as delinquent by the powers that be, women who ended up entrapped into various unpleasant legal situations. It looks at the period essentially before the Harlem Renaissance, and she talks about these women as essentially sexual or modernists, which is an interesting turn of phrase, sexual modernists. And they're largely anonymous women. A handful of better known figures appear, interestingly, on the periphery of her account. It's a well-documented book. I mean, there aren't traditional footnotes, but everything that's quoted is included in a note at the back of the book, and there are numerous photographs and well-documented sources for the photographs. So this I would highly recommend if you have an interest in women's lives or in the lives of Black women in North America. So this was a happy reading experience for me. The book hangover came from Shuggie Bain. So this one, there's been lots and lots of chatter about this one, and it's on the Booker shortlist, yeah? So I read this over the course of 2 or 3 days, and I'd say that I think it is a fine novel, but it is a dire novel. It describes dire things in 1980s, 1990s Glasgow, in a family that's split into pieces by the mother Agnes's alcoholism. And I think Stuart has a very fine way of describing setting and scene and the consequences of bad choices people make or bad circumstances. So I thought that was great. I particularly enjoyed parts of it because, especially in the first quarter, the language is very, very Glaswegian. My parents-in-law were from Greenock and Largs, just outside Glasgow. So when I would read this, I could hear their voices, and I could hear the kind of often very sharp, pointy humor that comes through in a Scots voice. So this, I think, is actually a very Scottish novel, but not a happy thing to read. Don't have any sense of whether it'll win the Booker or not, but a difficult read in many ways. Like a lot of books about poverty and alcoholism, it reminded me of something I read years ago. I haven't reread The Skinny Little Thing. This is Road to the Stilt House by David Adams Richards. He's essentially a New Brunswick writer, and he covers similar kinds of ground, except in a rural setting. So he'll explore lives of families with too much drink in them and not enough money. And this one is pretty dire, and actually one of Richardson's shortest novels. So I think I might reread that one after I get over my Shuggie Bain hangover. I finished as well a mystery novel, Ian Rankin's latest, Song for Dark Times. Another Scottish novel, but very different in purpose and tone than Stuart's. It's pretty standard Rankin fare, well written, but not particularly deep. Essentially a distraction. We all need distractions from time to time. I finished my Inuit book, Hunter with a Harpoon, as well. It's a short little thing, and I really liked it. The language is really stripped down, and it's very saga-like in some ways. The perspective of the characters shifts, so there are essentially 4 voices that appear. I found it surprisingly moving. If you get a chance to pick it up, I would recommend it. It would take you maybe an hour and a half to read. I'd be interested to hear what you might think of it. So for the week coming up, I'm going to try to finish Clutter by Jennifer Howard. It's this little one. It so far is a fairly straightforward look at what drives people to keep too much stuff in their homes. And the first chunk of it, the prologue, recounts Howard's reaction to having to clear out her mother's home when her mother had dementia and was for a long time a hoarder. I found that very familiar territory and in some ways very difficult to read for me personally, because I had to clean up my mother's house at the end of her life. She wasn't a hoarder, but she did die of dementia, and people with dementia lose all tracks of their belongings, and it can be a challenge to sort out their things. What else do I think I will finish? I started in on this one, Mauve, by Simon Garfield. This is a history of the discovery of coal tar and the dyes that come from it. I've enjoyed this one. It surprised me. I haven't thought about chemistry since I took organic chemistry years and years ago. So this one I think I should be able to make good headway on for my nonfiction November reads. What else do I have on the go? Oh, I don't have it here anymore, but I finished Crow Winter by Karen McBride, one of my Indigathon reading items. This, I think, is a pretty uneven novel, Crow Winter. Very much a debut novel, I think. The protagonist has returned home to deal with her father's death, and in the process is dealing with how to describe it without giving away the plot. The history of the quarry behind her family home, and essentially a land claim issue and a resource extraction issue. And McBride explores that along with exploring the ideas of a Nana Bush character and Indigenous spirituality. And parts of that are very finely done, but there are other parts of it that needed, I think, more work. There are sections where she slips certain characters into speaking in dialect, and that doesn't work very well in this particular novel. I'm glad I read it because I'm always interested in reading more Indigenous material and interested in reading first novels from people, but not as strong as I had hoped it would be. So, week coming up, as well as finishing Mauve and Clutter, I think I'll start this one. This is Gloria Naylor's The Women of Brewster Plays. It's an old copy from the library. I haven't read much Naylor, maybe one, but I thought I would pick this one up. I think it's one of her earliest ones, so I'm looking forward to reading that. And in terms of nonfiction, I'm also hoping to do a little bit of reading in my research area on library history. I'm hoping to make headway in Apostles of Culture. This is D. Garrison's book. It was a pretty foundational and provocative account of the history of libraries 20, 30 years ago. And it's still invoked in much of the literature around library history, but I think it's often invoked without actually being read. This copy came from my university library, which has a library school associated with it, and it's quite clear that this book has been read maybe once before, but not studied. There are no markings in it, none of the kind of markings you would typically find in a standard text in any discipline. So I've started this. She writes well. Some of the argument is based on outdated theory, but I'm glad to be finally getting to this one. I I think that's it for me this week in terms of what I've read and what I'm hoping to read. I hope you have had a good week and that you're treating yourself well and treating your kin well. Take care. Bye-bye.